about leaves and what are the functions of leaves then, does anyone, again, like I said the last time, I like to get a little bit of input. What are some things that plants use leaves for?
To absorb the
food.
sun.
Okay. I heard two different answers at one time. Mary.
Absorb the sun.
Okay.
Makes food.
They make food. And what's the process by which they make food?
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis. So that is their primary function. Are there any other things that leaves do?
Exchange oxygen into the air, exchange gas.
They are a site for oxygen exchange. That is correct. So respiration occurs in leaves. Anything else?
They're very visual.
So we have photosynthesis. That was the first one. And again, when we look at photosynthesis, we're talking about the word photo means light, synthesis means creation. So basically what we're doing is we're creating, and what we're creating are sugars in the presence of light. That's what photosynthesis literally means. So we call the leaves the factories of the plants. So that's the first function of them, is photosynthesis. Another thing that leaves can do is they can be a wildlife deterrent. When you have leaves that have a lot of spines or prickly edges, things like that, or even some of the hairy ones, they just, they're not as palatable. So they can be, on certain plants, a wildlife deterrent to keep deer and other things from browsing. That way that plant's more likely to live, particularly when things get dry and animals are looking for food. Another thing that they're used for by some plants is propagation, because certain types of leaves, particularly more succulent leaves, are able to be the source of a propagule. So you can start new plants with just a leaf in some situations, but primarily we're going to see that in succulents, because with that succulent, it's going to already have carbohydrates stored up in that leaf and extra water stored in that fleshy leaf. So and you've probably noticed that at times when you have some leaves of some succulents that have dropped to the ground, they'll sometimes root. So that's one. And another part of that could be water storage. A lot of plants have very fleshy leaves, and when it does go into drought conditions, guess what? Those leaves start to shrivel and move down, and that water's used for other functions within the plant. So water storage is part of it, and also food storage. Shading is another element that you don't always think about, but particularly this time of year, if you go and look at some taller trees, look at the very top of the canopy. You'll see like the leaves at the very, very top look really ratty. They're dying, partially dead, but the interior leaves of that tree tend to be greener. They look a lot better because they're getting some shading from above when it gets extremely hot. And so they can provide shading for other leaves, or, we get that benefit too of shading, but really they can shade themselves. So the interior leaves are more efficient with photosynthesis then. And also cooling. This is another thing people don't think about, but the plants are actually a cooling center of the plant, because as the process of transpiration, we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's essentially water that's evaporating inside that leaf. And when that water evaporates, it produces a cooling effect inside the leaf, and it serves as a way to take the temperature of the leaf down so that, again, photosynthesis is more efficient. So transpiration is another way that another function that plants have for leaves. So the parts of a leaf, again, these are just some terms you may see, and I want you just to be aware of some of these terms. The tip, when we're talking about a leaf tip, that is that usually a point. It doesn't always have to be a point, but it's that far end away from the petiole. So it's the far end. When we talk about the blade, that is kind of the parts that are in between the veins. You can see here, this one has a midrib going up the middle. That's this main vein. And then you're going to have lateral veins in there. Again, things that you may see those terminology of. The margin is basically the outside edge, just like you would have margin on a paper. And the petiole is the part of the leaf that's connecting to the stem. The part of the leaf that connects to the stem is that little petiole. So that's that's a term you'll probably hear a little bit more than some other things. When that leaf is first coming out and emerging, there's these two little structures, pseudo leaves, I guess, or some kind of a scale covering that those are called stipules. If you happen to hear that word, that's basically what's covering that leaf before it emerges. So those are some terms you may see, particularly petiole is an important one. The blade, again, that's the main part in between the veins, which is where photosynthesis takes place, is in the blade or the lamina of the leaf. The midrib is that central vein, and of course the margin is the edge. So let's take a cross section of a leaf. If you take it from and cut through that leaf, you're going to see several different layers of cells. And so we're going to just start up at the top, show you the layers of a leaf. The top is not even a cell, it's a waxy layer on the top called the cuticle. And it's typically thicker on the top. You may have a little bit of cuticle on the bottom, as you see here in orange, but particularly on top, you tend to see it thicker because, again, that's where you're gonna have the most sun and it's gonna need the most protection. And it's there to hold in water and primarily. Then you have the epidermis, which is this upper layer of cells. And there's, again, that's the skin layer of cells. And there's also one at the bottom. So you'll see epidermis, the upper epidermis, the lower epidermis here. Underneath the upper epidermis, you tend to find these columns of cells. This is called palisade parenchyma. And that is where most of photosynthesis is taking place. They tend to have a lot of chlorophyll within them, and they're packed together. And that's why the top of the leaf is sometimes darker green than the bottom of the leaf. So you have this palisade parenchyma, and you also have below it, then you have this area that is still parenchyma cells, which are basic, they're just basic plant cells. But you have this spongy layer, and there's a lot of air pockets between them, and that allows both air and water vapor to move in and out of that leaf and around that leaf, because you've got to get water, you've got to get oxygen, you've got to get carbon dioxide moving back and forth up to all these other cells. And so this also kind of gives it a little more depth of the leaf. So you see it's actually usually a thicker layer than the palisade parenchyma, and it kind of pushes up. So you have this spongy layer before you get to that lower epidermis. On that lower epidermis, you're going to see two cells here. I'll show you those again in a different angle, but these are the guard cells. This is where air moves in and out, is in the space. The stomatal pore is this little hole that opens and closes based on the guard cells. When the guard cells have adequate moisture, that hole is open and allows moisture to move in and out. When there's not as much water available, then those guard cells become flaccid and they close the stomatal pore. And the guard cell and that stomatal pore together are sometimes called stoma. And this is one of those places where I'm going to fall into my botany side and not my horticultural side. One of the words that we use a lot is the word stomate, and really that's not a proper word. It is, you have stoma or stomas, and those are the holes, the air holes from that water vapor and oxygen, carbon dioxide move in and out of the leaf. So in between all these, again, you'll see all those air spaces between. Within the leaf, we have veins within the leaf. Some of them are very thick, some of them are smaller. And that vein This is a cross section of that vein coming through. You have the smaller xylem cells and you have larger phloem cells. Do y'all remember what does the xylem do? What's anyone? One person. I see Linda
Transports
mouthing
water.
it. It transports what?
Water.
Water and what else?
Nutrients.
Nutrients up.
It moves water and nutrients up into the leaf. Because again, Reed said the leaves were the plant factories. And then the phloem moves what?
The starches, the sugars.
Starches or carbohydrates or sugars down. It phloems down, remember? We talked about that. And within a leaf, we'll talk about veins or this kind of bundle sheath. We see that within a leaf, but in a monocot, you're going to see that throughout the stem as well. But you're not going to see the same arrangement again in the stem of a dicot. So again, this is that vein, and then it just has the bundle sheath extension. These are basically just like brick cells that are holding that vein in place, that vascular bundle of xylem and phloem in the right spot of the leaf. So you're going to have water and nutrients coming up through the xylem. They move throughout with moisture into the leaf for photosynthesis, and then the carbohydrates are moved back into the vein and are transported out. And then you have, again, the stomatal pore here. That's where oxygen and carbon dioxide and water vapor move in and out of the leaf. Okay, so that's the cross section of a leaf. So just kind of wanted you to see what that factory looks like if you cut it open. Okay, any questions?
Michael,
Yes, Fred.
does the midrib and the lateral veins, do they look the same?
Pretty much they do. You'll probably have a little bit more xylem and phloem in the midrib, and they'll be a little bit smaller, a little bit less in the smaller ones in the smaller veins. So with that, then I'm going to move on and talk the next thing about leaves is we talk about the veins, when we talk about venation of a plant, that's the vein structure, and the shape, it deals with the shape too. So you have a pinnate venation, which has that central midrib, and then you have the little secondary veins coming directly off of it, just like a feather. You have a palmate venation. You have really several large midribs, and then they separate out like the palm of your hand, like the fingers moving out. And then you have parallel venation, where you usually have one larger vein and then multiple smaller ones, but they're going the direction of the leaf. And that's in a monocot versus these first two are dicots. So when we talk about venation, we talk about pinnate venation, like a pin feather of a bird, a palmate venation like your palm of your hand or a maple leaf, and then parallel venation of grasses. Okay, that's going to talk about some types and shapes of leaves. This is important because when you start going into describing plants, particularly on the botany side of things, they're going to talk about the leaf shape and the leaf attachment, the leaf margins, what those margins look like. So I want you to be familiar with some of the terms that they are discussing in case someone's going like, oh, that can't be a Schefflera because it doesn't have a compound palmate leaf. And you're going, what's a compound palmate leaf? So I'm going to show you some of those terms real quick. Again, just to get you familiar with some of the things that are there. First of all, we have either simple or compound leaves. A simple leaf is all in one piece. It's all connected together. And a compound leaf looks like sections of a leaf that are all connected to the same petiole. Remember, that's what attaches it to the stem. So within a simple leaf, you can have a simple pinnate leaf or a simple palmate leaf, which were the two that we showed you before. I'm going to show you pictures again. And then within a compound leaf, you can have a pinnate compound leaf, or you can have a palmate compound leaf, or you can have a doubly pinnate palmate leaf, or sometimes they call it a bipinnately compound leaf. So you may see that term, but essentially you have multiple separations of the compound factor. So let's look at those a little bit individually. Within that, when they're talking about leaf types and shapes, they'll also talk about the leaf tips. Remember, that's the point on the end. The leaf margins, that's the edges. And again, they're used for descriptions and classifications. That's a little more on the botany side of it, but it's important for you to know parts of that. So for example here, this is a simple pinnate leaf. Again, it looks like a feather. You can tell that it's a dicot because it has netted veins within it. It has a central midrib. This is the tip. You'll see this has a slightly serrated margin. You can see where it has little cutouts, kind of like a serrated knife on that edge there. And then this is the petiole. This is the part that attaches directly to the stem. Because it's one part, it's simple. Because of the overall shape, it's pinnate. So it's a simple pinnate leaf. Okay. The next one, oh, what just happened? I hit a wrong button. Hold on. Let me figure out what I just hit. There we go. So the next one I want to show you is a simple palmate leaf. This is a sycamore leaf. It is a native to our area, similar to a maple leaf. But again, it's got the veins coming out like the palm of your hand, but it's all connected together. And that's why it is a simple palmate leaf. Again, there's the petiole that attaches it directly to the tree stem. And again, multiple central veins. Moving on then, this would be what we call a compound pinnate leaf. Does anyone know what plant or tree this is from? I know Linda's saying something, but I can't hear her.
Avocado? I don't know.
Close. Well, it's actually the state tree of Texas. Anyone, does that give you a hint? Pecan tree.
Yeah.
And a pecan tree, if you look at this is all one leaf. When you have a compound leaf, this is all one single leaf. This is the petiole where it attaches to the stem. Remember, we said where a leaf attaches to a stem, you're going to have a bud in that axil. If you take this under a magnifying glass or a microscope, there's no bud here, there's no bud there, there's no bud there. This is not a leaf. The whole thing is one leaf. Each one of these is a leaflet. And the way you can tell that on a compound versus a simple leaf is to get a magnifying glass out if you need to. You shouldn't have to for most of us. And look at the base of this leaflet and see if you see a little bud in there. That's how you can tell if it's a compound versus a simple leaf. So that's a compound pinnate leaf. This is a compound palmate leaf of a Hawaiian Schefflera. Again, here's the petiole that goes out and attaches to the stem. Oh, I'm sorry, got ahead of myself. Each one of these is a leaflet, because if you look in the center here, there is no bud. This does not create a new branch out of here. Okay, so that's a compound palmate leaf. And then this would be a bipinnately compound or a double compound pinnate leaf. So this is one entire leaf, and this is from a honey locust, but it is doubly compound because this is the central rachis, central midrib, and then it separates once, and then you have leaflets off of those separations. So that's why it's doubly pinnate compound. Mesquite trees are the same type of doubly compound leaf to it. So when you look at that, this is not a mesquite leaf here. That is a leaflet. This is not a mesquite leaf here. That is multiple leaflets. It is the entire piece that usually has a double separation on it on a mesquite tree. So you'll see where it keeps separating out. Look for, and again, if you look in these areas here, there's nothing, no bud, no leaf or branch bud in there. So then with those leaves, let's look a little bit about arrangement. You'll hear some terminology for arrangement, which is also used for identifying plants. We talk about a rosulette or a rosette. they go around in a circle like in a rose. Alternate meaning it goes back and forth, and then opposite means you have two attached at the same place. And I will show you pictures. And then world shows you have a circle and of leaves, and it moves up to another circle. So let's look at some pictures of these terms of leaf arrangement. Very important in plant identification, particularly when you get into wildflowers and native plants and things like that in the botany world. So those leaf arrangements, I got from two different illustrations. When we talk about something being opposite, you have two leaves attached to the same place on a stem directly across from each other, kind of like a ladder where you have a rung of a ladder that extends out beyond it. So two leaves at the same spot. Alternate means they alternate back and forth, one to the left, one to the right, one to the left, one to the right, back and forth. And world means you have more than two attached to the same spot around that stem, like in this catalpa. So you have like three leaves attached to the same spot. Again, here it is from a different book. Alternate, back and forth, alternating, 1, 2, 1, 2. Opposite, they're two leaves that are opposite of each other, and then whorls have a little ring of leaves, and it moves up another ring of leaves, etc. Okay. So that's leaf arrangement, some terminology of leaf arrangement you may see. Okay. Questions?
Which one's the rosette?
The rosette is going to be more like whorls, but they're going to be real tight and compact. A lot of your succulents have that rosette arrangement because you're going to have multiple leaves almost in a circle going around. So really that just is usually a whorl, and they're just, the stem is so compact.
Hey, Michael.
Yep.
Can you give us a copy of your PowerPoint so that we can study all this, or how much are we supposed to know for in the test?
You shouldn't need, I mean, it's all going to be when you get your book, and I don't know when the book's coming in. I will send I'll share a copy of the PowerPoint with them on, it's a big file. So I will save it. I'll try to save it as a PDF, but some of the pictures are on top of each other. So you'll get most of the words, but you may lose a few pictures that way. And I'll send it to them in a Dropbox in the next couple days.
Yeah, if you could send it to me as Dropbox. I've got last year's, but you said you
I've made a few changes.
Yeah, some changes. So I'd like to update what we have. And
Okay.
then I'll convert it to a PDF compressed file and share it with them and put it on a VMS also.
Okay, Vince. Okay, here we go. Moving on. Once that's the last of the vegetative plant parts. Now we're going to talk about reproductive plant parts real quick. And we said the vegetative parts are the roots, the stems, and the leaves. And so we have reproductive plant parts, which would be the flowers and then the fruits and seeds eventually. So those are the reproductive plant parts. But when we get into this, I want you to think about plants a little bit different, because we see plants and we see flowers. And I had a professor at A&M Kingsville when I was down there, Dr. George Willigas, and he made a statement my first day of botany class, and it has stuck with me because it made me think about plants differently. And his statement that day was, plants are sexy. How many of us think of plants as being sexy? You know, we just see them as plants, you know, but within that plant, they have to do things to either attract pollinators, things like that, to be able to reproduce. And so he was saying, when you look at a flower, that's the sexual part of a plant. And I think he just did it for shock value, but it did make me think about plants a little bit differently. His example was in sago palms out there, because we had a lot of sago palms around the building, the biology building. And if you look, when you get the big cone coming out, because a sago palm actually has both a male and a female plant. So when you have the big cone coming out of it, the center of a sago palm, that is the male sago palm. And the female actually has kind of a big bulb in the middle, and when it's pollinated, then it makes seeds, naked seeds, that appear and then fall from the center. And so it was just that perspective of looking at plants a little bit differently and not just thinking of them as leaves and the stems, but that the flowers are actually an important part and tell you if it is in a reproductive state or the vegetative state. So his point of plants are sexy has stuck with me for 25 plus years, 30 plus years. And so think about plants a little bit different now. So let's look at the flowers real quick. I want to make sure we have time to get through this and then get through plant processes. That's the other thing I'm charged with, and we're 30 minutes less than I expected today. So here we go. This is going to go kind of fast, but it's easy, and it'll all be in your book, and you're going to get the PowerPoint too. So the flowers, I want you to know some facts about flowers. First of all, flowers are essentially modified leaves. So flowers have leaf arrangements, and if you look in a flower, that's a whorled leaf arrangement within there. You have whorls, a whorl or two or three or four of petals, and you have whorls of the stamen and whorls that are fused together to make the pistil and things like that. So, but flowers are essentially just a modification of leaves. And again, like I said, they're arranged in whorls. Things we talked about the last time, if they're in multiples of 3, it's a monocot. If they're multiples of 4s and 5s, they're a dicot. So that helps you with identification, just looking at a flower and being able to look at the number of petals or a stamen or something like that. And again, the function of flowers, the number one function of flowers is to be pretty, right? No, the number one function of flowers is reproduction, seed production for genetic variability. And the other thing they're there for is they have to attract the pollinators. They've got to have a way of getting the pollen to the proper place on the pistil. So they're there for reproduction and therefore as a pollinator attractor. And that's why you have certain colors. And then there's certain flowers that have actually been modified that you have bracts, which are, again, they're modified leaves that hold their color longer than a traditional petal. Like on a bougainvillea, the colorful part of the bougainvillea are really bracts. And if you look at the little, in the bougainvillea flower, you have a little skinny, usually white flower that's sticking up like a little tube in the middle. That's the true part of the flower. Or on a poinsettia, you have the red leaves around it. Those are the bracts. And then if you look at the little yellow centers of what we think of as one flower, those are all individual flowers, all those little yellow centers. Each one's called a cyathea. And that whole, what we think of as a flower, that branch has a inflorescence, which are multiple flowers that appear as one grouping. So again, their function is for reproduction, pollinator attraction. And the other thing I want you to know about flowers is that the ovary ripens. The ovary, which is part of that flower, its purpose is to ripen to produce a fruit and seeds. Seeds are important because they give us genetic variability. And that allows things to survive longer and have that variation is going to make it more likely for something to, 1, to survive or 2, to survive in adverse conditions. So looking at, excuse me, the picture of a flower real quick, and some of our faces are cutting off a little bit of this, but I think you will get the general idea. These are whorls along here. The pedicel is the portion that emerges from the main stem. The receptacle is kind of the base of that flower, and just above that is that's what all the whorls are attached. The whorls are attached to this receptacle. We have, let me find lost my point. There it is. So you have the receptacle here. You have sepals, which when you see a flower bud, like a rose bud open up, the green part, before it fully opens, that's the sepal. So when you have that covering, the green covering, that's what a sepal is when you hear that term. Then you have inside that, you have petals, which are the colorful components typically that are used to attract the pollinators. So you have the protective layer of the sepal when it's developing, and then as it opens, you have the petal. You talk about those two collectively when you have the petal and the sepal together. Sometimes that's called the perianth. You don't have to know that as a horticulturist, but a biologist may throw in that word. So you have the sepals, the petals. That's the pretty part typically. Then I want to show you, we have the male and the female portion. The next layer in, the next whorl, because you have a whorl of sepals, you have a whorl of petals. You could have 2 or 3 or 4 whorls of petals. When you have a double flower, you have multiple whorls of petals. Then you have the anther whorl, and just like if your petals are in multiples of 3s or 4s or 5s, your anthers will be in multiples of 3s or 4s or 5s, depending on whether it's a monocot or a dicot. And the male portion here is collectively called the stamen. Pretty easy to remember, you know. The long portion is called the filament that holds the anther up, and the anther is the yellow portion at the top that holds the pollen grains. So that's what the top portion here is, where the pollen actually is. And this is just a pole to help hold it up so that either wind gets to it or insects get to it easier, or that it's closer to the female portion. So this is the male portion here, the stamen, the filament, and the anther. Then the female portion basically has 3 main parts. You have an ovary at the bottom, the big, there's my pointer, the big O at the bottom. The ovary, inside it is an egg, but the big part is the ovary, and you can have multiple eggs within there. You have another extension here, which is the style, and then at the end you have a sticky portion called the stigma. Those 3 together, the stigma, the style, and the ovary, is going to be called the pistil for the female portion. So stigma, style, and ovary or ovule. And I remember these. I mean, you find out what helps you remember the parts, but these are kind of important parts of a flower. The stigma is sticky, and that's how I remember that the stigma is sticky. It's up at the end. And then you have this long pathway that the pollen's going to have to go down. And I think of that as like the runway of a style show. That's how I remember style, is that long portion. And then of course, ovary is a big O, and that's where the eggs are. So let's look at it in a different picture. Maybe that'll help. But again, the male portion is the stamen with both the anther and the filament, and the female portion is the pistil. And the flowers are the petals, and the sepals are the perianth. So here we go, anther and filament, stigma, style, and ovary, petals and sepals. Okay. Nice and fast review of that. So let's look at how pollination actually happens. The pollen grains, which came from the anther, and they can be moved either by insects, by wind, by water, lots of different ways. They land, those pollen grains land on the top of the pistil, on the stigma, the sticky portion that holds the pollen grain in place. And then that pollen grain, inside it is the sperm. And that pollen grain will produce a chemical that will actually form a tube down the style. And that's what these are. These are pollen tubes. And it's just a chemical that has kind of eaten a little tube section out of the style. And that allows the sperm to then swim down to the ovules where the eggs are. So that is the pollen grain, a pollen tube moving down the style. Remember the style show, the long walkway, going down to the big O of the ovule where the eggs are. And this one would have multiple ovules, so you're going to have multiple seeds produced within it. So, so that's the flower. And with this, we're going to go through the fruit really quickly. That remember that ovule at the bottom, where the ovary is, that is where seeds are going to be produced. And when it is fertilized and it matures, the matured ovules become the seeds, and that ovary, when it matures, that's what your fruit is. A fruit is nothing but a ripened ovary. A fruit is a ripened ovary. And there's some dry fruits, there's fleshy fruits. So here's a couple of examples. Corn, grains of wheat, things like that are going to be your dry fruits. A lot of your monocots have dry fruits on them, but they have the same basic part. You have the seed, which is in the center, but for a dry fruit, you have a very thin pericarp, which is the outside covering, the protective layer. And so here, those are basically all mashed together like a hard layer, where in a fleshy fruit, a larger fruit, you're going to have that pericarp is going to have more distinctive fatter layers. You have the exocarp, meaning exo meaning outer. You have the mesocarp, meaning the middle. That's the fleshy part of the fruit. And then you have an endocarp, which is going to be the interior and the protective layer around the seed. So again, a fleshy fruit, you have this. So in a peach, that protective endocarp is what we call the outside of the pit of the peach fruit. And the fuzzy part we're used to on a peach, that's the exocarp. And the part we like to eat is the mesocarp. You know, those are great terms if you're a botanist, but they're not necessarily what we need to remember as horticulturists. But realize you have those same layers, they're just really thin and compressed on like a kernel of corn, because they're both ripened ovaries. Okay. So let's talk about a few types of fruit, some terms that are out there. Some you may see these, you may not. I'm going to show you examples of a berry, a pepo, a pome, a hesperidium, a drupe, a pod, an aggregate, and a multiple fruit. So it's just easier to show you an example of each. But a berry means it can have one to many seeds. It does not have a hard or a stony interior endocarp. So you don't have that hardness inside. And so a tomato is actually a form of berry. We don't think of it that way. Or a grape is a form of a berry. They all do have seeds, one or multiples inside, but the interior is soft of the endocarp. So a berry, a pepo are going to be your cucurbits, cucumbers, melons, relatives in that group, squash. They're going to have multiple seeds on the inside. Again, your rind is going to be your exocarp, and then you have all those seeds inside in a couple different configurations. So thick rind, multiple seeds, usually a fleshy component of the mesocarp. Okay. A pome is another, that's ovary. It's surrounded by a fleshy section, and that's going to be your pears and your apples, those particularly the main portion there. So again, when you look at how this develops, remember your flower, this is a ripened ovary. This was the pedicel. This is the part where the flower attached to the stem. That's the stem of the fruit. And then this is that ripened ovary. And then up here, these are the remnants of the calyx, which are the remnants of the petals and the sepals. So that's what that little point, that kind of end of the other end of the apple, that's what it's from. But just give you an idea, when they talk about a pome fruit, you're usually talking apples and pears in that group of fruit. A Hesperidium are citrus, and they have a thick rind, and they have sections within them. So think about an orange, think about a lemon, grapefruits, things like that, limes. They have these segmented sections within them. So, and they have a rind. So that's what a Hesperidium is. A drupe is something that has a hard seed in the middle, or a pit, and some kind of a fleshy component. And peach is the one we usually think of, but a coconut technically is too, because the center part of the coconut, when you look at the whole fruit, you know, it's a little different. But the main one we'll think of probably is peach being the main drupe form. So peaches and plums and things like that. Pods, pea pods, the pretty obvious one there. You have the outside layer, beans, peas, things like that, and you'll have this row with the ovaries on them with the seeds. So you have this row of ovules, and that's each one develops into a like a pea or a bean. So that's with your legumes primarily. And then when they're mature, they split open. You see something very similar to on a plumeria. When it opens, it has that pod shape with multiple seeds inside. So it is what they call a dehiscent fruit. An aggregate fruit is where you have multiple ovaries that fuse together. So the pistils from that single flower, they're fused together, and that gives you this multiple fruit, raspberries, strawberries, things like that. And then a multiple fruit has multiple flowers that are ripened in mulberries, and pineapples are examples of that you have multiple flowers that are kind of connected together, and they fuse together to make the final fruit form. So those are examples of fruit. Just if you hear those terms, it gives you some examples to think about. Quickly looking at seeds. We've talked a lot about, quite a bit about them in the past, but essentially the function of the seed, the number one function is genetic variability for reproduction. It's a way to get a lot of plants in a hurry. And again, that genetic variability. That every seed contains three things. It has an embryo, and it has a seed coat around it for protection, and in the middle it has an endocarp where or the cotyledon or the endosperm. That's the food part. So a seed has to have a food source for that embryo to use until it emerges from the soil, and it has to have the baby plant or the embryo, and then the seed coat. So when you look at that, you know, we looked at the bean seed, that little bitty tiny bean, there's a living, breathing plant with root stems and leaves. They're just teeny tiny inside that seed. Same thing with a corn plant. But then there's a food source around it, which is the cotyledon that we showed the last one, or the endosperm, which is the main part of the kernel of the corn. And then you have a coating on the outside that protects it until the conditions are right to germinate. So that's plant parts. That's the end of plant parts. Is your mind swimming for having all of that in the last 40 minutes or so? Again, this is an overview. You can review it when you get your book. I just want you to be familiar with some terms, and because you will hear some speakers talk about certain terms in the future. So let's go on and talk about plant processes. We have about an hour to cover this. And so the plant processes we're going to talk about today, this is probably another semester's worth of, or a good half a semester that we're going to cover in the next hour or so. So we're going to talk about translocation, which is the vascular system. We've talked a little bit about it. We're going to talk about photosynthesis and respiration and transpiration and evaporation and photoperiodism and thermal floral induction and dormancy. So we're going to cover all this in the next 40 minutes or 45, 50 minutes. But we've covered a lot of this already. We've talked about it. So I'm hoping you will see parts of this and go, oh, okay, now I understand why the leaf is designed that way, or why this flower was like this. So some of these will have we've broadly talked about already. And tropisms, I forgot about that. And those are plant reactions to specific stimulus. So let's just talk about translocation real quick. And again, that's movement of substances throughout the plant vascular system. We talked about the plant vascular system. There's two parts, remember? You have give me one of the vascular, any one person tell me one.
Xylem,
The
phloem,
xylem
venations. Yeah.
and the phloem. Thank you, Linda. The xylem is this xylem and phloem. That's the basic part. It's the highway system. We talked about that. You have xylem is moving the water and nutrients. Which direction? Up. It's moving moving water and nutrients up. The phloem is moving the carbohydrates down. So things that we've already talked about. Water and nutrients have to get from the roots up into the leaves for photosynthesis, and then the sugars made there have to get their way down into other parts of the plant. So with that, we talked about the epidermis. Just like on a leaf, the epidermis is nothing more than the outer skin, the outer layer of cells, just like we have as animals. You have vascular bundles. This is a monocot because it has vascular bundles, and in this vascular bundle, you have xylem to the inside and phloem to the outside of every one of those vascular bundles. And then there's cells in between. Some of those are holding water, some are just a water storage, or they could have carbohydrate storage. So those cells in between are called the cortex, and they're basically just storage cells and placeholders. And a dicot, instead of having vascular bundles, we talked last time about having rings, and the center portion is the pith, and it's not really active, but you have an active layer of xylem, which is moving water and nutrients up. And just beyond that, you have a ring of phloem, which is moving the carbohydrates down. Again, very familiar. And then the outside layer is what we call the bark. In between, here's something I want you to notice. In between the xylem and the phloem, there's a little thin layer of cells called the cambium. The cambium is their meristematic cells. Remember, meristems make new cells. So what the cambium does is it makes new xylem cells to the inside and new phloem cells to the outside of that layer. So as it's building new xylem cells to the inside, it makes new rings of xylem every year. As it's making new phloem to the outside, it's pushing the old phloem out. And because that old phloem is being pushed out, it essentially will slough off. Kind of like if you take a balloon that's painted and you blow it up, the outside, the paint will crack. Well, that old phloem on the outside of the stem is called what as it's peeled off? Bark.
Bark.
I saw some mouthing on that one. So it's the bark that, and it's there for protection. So I want you to also look real quick. There's a reason why these are in that layer. I always said xylem's to the inside. And the reason why the xylem's always to the inside is you got to have water and nutrients. You got to protect that no matter what to get up to the leaves. So it makes sense when you're structurally, when this was designed, plants were designed, and I don't think it's random that it's the xylem's to the inside. It's for the most protection of the water and nutrients to get up to the factory. Because if you have carbohydrates up there in the leaves, those leaves can make roots and can make new plants. And this old phloem sloughing off to the outside, it's a protective layer. Now, the problem we see as master gardeners, you'll see this too, is that on trees, this layer of phloem on the outside, that old phloem, that bark, it gets knocked off all the time with weed eaters, and the gets bumped by lawnmowers and stuff all the time. And when that happens, the bark gets knocked off. Well, guess what? The next thing that gets knocked off, if you knock off all the bark, you start knocking off what next?
The phloem.
The phloem. If you don't have phloem, you don't have carbohydrates getting to the roots. So those roots will eventually starve. That's why we talk about protecting the base of trees so much, because you've got to have that phloem moving carbohydrates down to the roots, because the roots can't make carbohydrates. So it's really important to protect the base of those plants. So that girdling, what it's basically doing is it's removing the vascular system, and it'll eventually starve the roots. And that's why you sometimes see these trees that'll kind of hang on in the landscapes. But if you look at the base, they've been beat up by lawnmowers and weed eaters. That plant will eventually die just because it can't reconnect because it's had too much damage. Over time, it could, if it was just a little bit of damage, it can repair. Like if one side get knocked off, it can make some more and eventually make a layer that covers that back again. But when you have a lot removed, then basically you're just starving those roots because there's no phloem left. Okay. So that's all I'm going to talk about vascular system. Let's move to photosynthesis, because that's one of the most important processes of a plant is photosynthesis. And we said photosynthesis, photo means light, synthesis means to create. So again, we're creating sugars. Couple points you need to know is that only plants can make their own food. That means every other living creature is somehow connected to plants. So those people who, master gardeners, they're plant people. At some point, even if you're trying to learn how to grow plants, you're still a plant person. So those people that make fun of you being a plant person because they're a dog person or a cat person or a horse person or whatever, it's like, well, guess what? Your dog and your cat and your horse, if we don't have plants, they don't have anything to eat. So remember that plant people are really important because we have to protect the things that make the food that people and animals eat. Excuse me, let me grab a drink. So that's the first thing I want you to know about photosynthesis. So all living creatures are tied to plants. Those leaves we talked about are the plant factories. That's where photosynthesis happens. We're creating carbohydrates in there. And again, photosynthesis, the purpose of photosynthesis is to create the sugars or create the carbohydrates. That is the reason for photosynthesis. And here's my other pet peeve is when people talk about, we need to feed our plants and you need to buy some plant food. You don't buy plant food, you buy fertilizer, you buy nutrients. So please help to educate people that it's not plant food you're buying fertilizer and you're buying nutrients that are used. The plant will, if it has those things, then it can make its own food, make its own sugars. The true plant food are the carbohydrates the plant makes. So that's my soapbox for the day, or at least one of them I want you to know about. So again, this should look really familiar, only just from a different source. So I think it's good to see different pictures of it. Again, the cuticle on the top, you have the veins coming through, you have xylem and phloem. And here there's that palisade parenchyma. See, it's green. That green is chlorophyll. And it's in the chlorophyll where photosynthesis happens. It has to have that chlorophyll present. And then underneath you have the spongy parenchyma where the air is moving in and out. There's a stoma there. That's the air hole around the guard cells. So again, giving you that picture of how this is all happening. But again, palisade parenchyma, it's at the top. Most of your photosynthesis is happening on the top side of the leaf. Because again, that's where light's being absorbed. So let's talk a little bit about chemistry. Everyone loved chemistry lessons when you were in school. I'm going to show you the chemistry of photosynthesis real quick. when we talk about photosynthesis, we talk about carbohydrates. We talk about CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and water makes sugar and oxygen. Because the purpose of photosynthesis is making sugar. This is a basic sugar molecule. This is a glucose molecule, sugar molecule. C6, 6 carbons, H12, that's 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. In order to make this, you got to have you have to have carbon dioxide, and you have to have water in the presence of light. Part of you may remember in chemistry is that you had to have balanced equations. Is that, y'all remember that vaguely from the past?
Stoichiometry.
And so you start pulling in that part of you got to have a balanced equation. Well, if I have to have 6 carbons to make one sugar molecule, where do I get my carbon from? I get it from carbon dioxide. I have to have 6 of them. So that means that I have to have 6 carbon dioxides to have enough carbon. And when I do that, I'm going to have 12 oxygens. So, and then over here I have my water. I have to have 12 hydrogens. I only get that from water. So I get each water molecule has 2 hydrogens. So to get 12, I need 6 water molecules. So when you look at this, you get 6 carbons off of here, and then you get the 6 water molecules. That's going to give you the C6H12O6. And then we have this extra oxygen left over from the CO2. That's where oxygen is produced during photosynthesis. Oxygen is not the product of photosynthesis. It's a byproduct of photosynthesis. And thank you, God, that it is a byproduct of photosynthesis because we need it. But CO2, the main thing is taking the carbon dioxide and the water, and it combines. And when it combines, it's making chemical bonds. And that's where the energy of a sugar molecule is binding all of this carbon and hydrogen and oxygen together. And then you have that leftover oxygen, and that happens in the presence of light energy and within the chlorophyll, because it's in the chlorophyll molecules, those green molecules. You don't have chlorophyll, you're not going to have photosynthesis. So just kind of reminding you how all that happens. Water comes up, nutrients are coming up, it's happening in the leaves. You have sunlight that's being absorbed by the leaves, by the chlorophyll. That's the energy source. That's where the sunlight is, where the energy for those chemical bonds comes from. The carbon dioxide it needs, it's coming up through the leaf. Remember those stoma at the bottom and the spongy parenchyma? It needed that air exchange. So the carbon dioxide is available for photosynthesis. And then, so it's made in the leaves, the sugar is produced, it moves down through the phloem, but there's extra oxygen that moves out through the stoma and into the environment. So that's kind of a broad picture of where it happens in the plant. So that's photosynthesis in 4 minutes. That's the basics of photosynthesis. It's a simple equation. It's 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters give you 1 sugar molecule and 6 leftover waters. That's it. Move it, and it moves that way. And the light is what binds them together. That gives you the chemical bonds. And that's what's storing the energy in that sugar molecule. Okay. Well, let's talk then about respiration. Okay. The next point is that, and respiration is nothing but the opposite of photosynthesis. So one of the things I want you to remember is go back to your kindergarten class. How many of us remember kindergarten class? And we were told, animals breathe in oxygen, right? That's what they need to live, right? We're animals. We need oxygen to live. What do plants breathe in to live?
CO2.
Carbon dioxide.
That's what we were told, right? They don't breathe in carbon dioxide to live. They have carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Plant cells, just like animal cells, need oxygen to live. So we've been taught wrong all the way since the time we were in kindergarten or before, that oxygen is not what plants are breathing in to live. Oxygen is what they are using. That's, I mean, oxygen, I'm sorry, I put the wrong, I changed this slide earlier. If you said that they needed carbon dioxide, I got to see, I made a change earlier and I messed it up. If it's carbon dioxide, then you're wrong. If it's oxygen, you were right. So all living creatures have to breathe oxygen. All living cells need oxygen for respiration. Whether you're a plant cell or an animal cell, all cells are, if it's alive, it's respiring, and they require oxygen. Okay?
Yep.
So with that, respiration is just the breakdown of carbohydrates. And when you break that sugar molecule up, all of those chemical bonds are released, and those chemical bonds are the energy. And that's why sugar gives you energy when you eat sugar, because the chemical bonds are being broken down. So again, plants are breathing, they're respiring oxygen 24 hours a day, but they only do photosynthesis during the day. And remember, all cells, all plant cells, the root cells, the flower cells, the leaf cells, the stem cells, they all require oxygen for respiration. And the other thing that's interesting is that unlike animals, most animals have a respiratory system, plants don't. And so that oxygen has to just move passively through openings in the leaves, openings in the stems, and through the cells of the roots. And that's a lot of reason why we talk about the root system has to have good aeration, because when it's underwater and it's really compacted soil, you don't have as much oxygen available for root growth and root respiration, because it's not breathing in the leaves and sending the oxygen down. It's breathing from those roots. And so that's why soil aeration is so important to get those roots, to make sure they're respiring and they're healthy. And that's the other reason when you look at how roots grow, most roots are in the top 2 feet of the soil on most plants. You know, I remember being told that a pine tree is 50 feet up in the air and it's got roots 50 feet down, and it doesn't, because there's not a whole lot of oxygen 50 feet down. Now, there's a few that do, and they have adaptations. And like, for instance, there's adaptations in cypress trees. You know, those knees that come up in the water, they have air tubes that allow oxygen down to the root system. And that's an adaptation of it, but most plants don't have that. So that's respiration. So let's look at it chemically. Remember, we have a sugar molecule. And if we're breathing, what did we say we need for respiration? We need oxygen, right? We breathe in oxygen for respiration, and we exhale carbon dioxide. The other thing is, when we exhale, you know, we also exhale water vapor. You know, what did they always used to say in the movies? Tell if someone's alive or dead, get a mirror, put it under their nose, and see if you're seeing any water vapor. That was one of those keys, because if they're respiring, you should see some water vapor.
That's why the masks are bad.
And so here, this should look really familiar. So if you have one sugar molecule and you get 6 oxygens available, it's going to break this down, and it's going to create carbon dioxide, because you had 6 carbons here, so you need extra oxygen, and it's going to produce water. So this is the exact opposite of photosynthesis. That's all it is. If you're going this way, you're respiring. If you go the opposite way, the plant is conducting photosynthesis. So if you understand respiration, you understand photosynthesis. You should. If you understand photosynthesis, you should be able to understand the chemistry of respiration. It just depends on the direction and if you have light available and chlorophyll. Okay. So again, carbohydrates are being broken down. When that is broken apart, that complex sugar molecule, when those chemical bonds are broken, that's where energy comes from, or heat. And that's during respiration, you'll see an increase in temperature. That's another key point. Oxygen is required for respiration, and then the carbon dioxide and the water are the byproducts when it breaks down. So that's it. So photosynthesis versus respiration, let's look at them side by side. Photosynthesis produces food and or sugars, where respiration uses that sugar for plant energy. Photosynthesis stores the energy. Respiration is going to use energy or release energy. The photosynthesis occurs in all cells with chloroplasts, only in the green cells. But in respiration, the difference here is that it occurs in all cells. Root stems, leaves, flowers, you name it. Photosynthesis will release oxygen. That means respiration is going to require oxygen or use oxygen. And where photosynthesis uses water, it's going to produce water in respiration. So that's photosynthesis versus respiration. They're just different sides of the same coin. Which way are you going? Are you putting those molecules together or tearing them apart? Okay. That took me weeks in college to understand. So hopefully that gives you a good overview. Now I had to know a lot more than y'all are doing, but I think it's a good, easy way to remember it. So then transpiration. Transpiration is the loss of water through the plant leaves. That's the basic definition. And the reason why it's important is it's evaporative cooling. When water evaporates, it requires, it takes heat, it uses heat, and it cools things down. That's the reason why when you get out of the swimming pool, you get out of the bathtub and you have water on you and you get chilled, that's evaporative cooling. The same thing is happening inside that plant leaf. As water evaporates inside that plant leaf, it's cooling the inside of the leaf, because what's happening? That leaf is being beaten down by the sun. It's absorbing the energy of the sun, which is heat, and it heats up. So it needs to be able to cool itself down through evaporative cooling, through transpiration. So that's happening. If it happens inside a leaf, that evaporation is called transpiration. And that's why plants use a lot of water in the summer. They're absorbing a lot of extra water, and the water's not being used for photosynthesis. It's being used to keep the plant cool so that the temperature is right inside the leaf for photosynthesis. Some of the research up at Texas A&M in the 80s showed that 80% of the water that's absorbed by roots in the summer, this is a summertime stat, up to 80% of the water could be lost to transpiration. In the summer, you water plants a lot more. And it's not because the plant's growing. It's because the plant needs to be cooler. And go ahead, Linda.
So then the best time to water your plants, because the heat index and so forth, would be what time?
If you have it watered earlier in the day, that water is available in the soil and it will be taken up by the roots and into the leaves. And that process of having that water move up and out through the leaves, that's called the transpiration stream. So if watering earlier in the day is the best. Watering in the middle of the day, you lose a lot to evaporation, never gets absorbed. If you can't water in the morning and those plants are wilted in the evening, guess what? Water them in the evening so there's some water available to them as soon as possible, and then try to water more in the morning if you can.
Okay, thank you.
Get as much water into the soil as you can. Things that affect transpiration: temperature. As the temperature goes up, then the transpiration level goes up, because when it's hot, the plant wants to be cooler. When light levels are more intense, like in the summer, we have intense, we talk about sun. Our sun here is much more intense than other parts of the country if you go further north, just because of the angle of the sun in the summer. And our summer light is more intense than our winter light because of the angle of the earth. But that when the light level is really high, guess what? Light is energy. Light produces heat. Thus, more light means hotter temperature more transpiration to keep it cool. Wind can also affect transpiration. The more wind you have, it pulls, it blows across the leaf. It actually sucks water out of the leaf. And so when you have a lot of wind, a plant uses more water because it is pulling the moisture out of the leaf. And thus it's pulling it from the root system in the soil. That's why in the wintertime, when you have a cold front coming through and it has a lot of wind, we always say, water your plants before the cold front. And because you need to make sure that what water is in those leaves is not being pulled away by all the wind. Because then you have a dehydrated leaf and it's really cold, and that leaf is going to be more susceptible to damage. So in the summer, if you have high temperature and high light but low wind, it's not going to use quite as much water as if you have high temperature and high light and high wind like today. So those factors kind of work themselves together. The other thing is humidity, and this is the opposite one. When you have higher humidity, there's water available. When you have low humidity, that plant can lose more water out of the leaves. So in low humidity, like if you're in the desert and it's sunny and hot, it would use more water than if you were here at the coast. Does that make sense? I don't know. Okay, everyone good? Okay, so high temperature, more transpiration. High light level, more transpiration. More high wind, more transpiration. Higher humidity, less transpiration. That's the exception. So with transpiration, you want to see how transpiration works? Get a plant, put a plastic bag over a part of it, water the plant, and that inside the plastic bag, you're going to see water vapor appear. That's because the plant is sucking up moisture out of the pot and it's being released out of those leaves and it's condensing in the plastic bag. So if you want to see transpiration, that is just a little demonstration of how transpiration works. And this is all regulated by the guard cells. Remember the bottom of the leaf, we said there were guard cells. And in the middle of the guard cell, there's a little hole called the stoma. And when there's a lot of water and it's releasing water vapor, then these cells are turgid. And so they open up, they expand to the sides here, and that opens the hole because there's plenty of water available. But when there's not water available, then they're like long balloons. And if there's less, then they kind of flatten out and they're shorter. And that's when it closes, come on, where it is. It closes that hole. So when water's not available, then the holes may close. So that's how the guard cell is working to move water in and out and to control the water level inside the leaf. So just letting you know that's how transpiration moves in and out because of the guard cells and how they're reacting. So that's all of transpiration. And then a quick, easy one that follows it is evaporation. What is evaporation? That's, first of all, evaporation is technically, when we talk about it in horticulture, evaporation happens outside the plant. Because if it's inside the plant, we call it
Transpiration.
transpiration. Thank you. So again, if it's inside the plant, it's transpiration. If it's outside the plant, it's technically evaporation. And that is all evaporation is, whether it's inside or outside the plant. All it is water moving from a liquid state to a gaseous state. And typically we talk about that, we've used the word evaporation, that's happening in the soil or at the soil surface. I mean, you can have water on the top of a leaf and it can evaporate because it's not in the plant. So again, if water is just evaporating off the top of the surface of a leaf, that's evaporation. If it's inside the leaf, it's transpiration. So let's just look at where those things happen quickly. Precipitation, rain falling down, it's absorbed by the soil, it's taken up by the roots. Some of it evaporates from the soil surface, that's evaporation, or it's on the leaf surface and it evaporates. But if it's absorbed by the soil, it moves up through the roots into the leaves, then it is transpiration if it goes through the leaves. So evaporation is outside the plant, transpiration inside the plant. Okay, easy peasy. We're done with those parts. Now let's talk a little bit about photoperiods. Photo meaning light. Period is a time frame. So photoperiodism is how light, a period, a length of light affects plant growth. And so these are plant responses, primarily floral induction. That's what we talk about, due to day or technically night length. So we have some plants that when days are long, they flower. When days are short, they don't. We have other plants that when days are short, they flower, and when days are long, they don't. So these are what we're talking about. What's an example of a plant that is affected by day length to flower or not flower? Someone give me an example. There's
Morning glory tree.
a morning glory tree. That's one I'm assuming that it likes long days because I have not really paid attention to that one. That's one I'm not 100% sure of, but I'll take your word for it. It could be. What's a real common one?
Mums.
Mums, chrysanthemums they are blooming in the fall and in the winter when the days are short and the nights are long. What's another example of like that?
Poinsettia.
Poinsettias are another one that we use. Again, why do they bloom in the winter? Our days are short, our nights are long.
How about roses?
Roses are day neutral. They can bloom throughout the year, but they tend to have less blooming in the summer because it's so hot. It's more of a temperature dormancy, a thermal dormancy than a light period. But is there a flowering tree this time of year that everyone likes to plant in their yards? Crepe myrtle. Crepe myrtle is a photoperiodic plant. It blooms in the summer when the days are long and the nights are short. It doesn't bloom in the winter. So those are some examples, and I'll show you a few others. A short day plant, what we think of as a short day plant, because guess what? We look at things what we relate to. We go, oh, I'm awake in the day, so if the day is short, that's what causes the plant to flower. Technically, it's the uninterrupted night length that's the most important. So what we think of as a short day plant, like a poinsettia or a mum or a kalanchoe, if you didn't know that, kalanchoes, Christmas cactus, those are all examples of short day plants. Technically, we should be calling those long night plants because they need uninterrupted nights in order to bloom. So poinsettias, chrysanthemums, kalanchoes, long day plants, really, we should be calling those short night plants because it's the night that the plant responds to, not the day length. And some examples: lettuce, cilantro, crepe myrtle. Have you ever noticed that cilantro starts blooming in May and June? It's because it's a long day, short night plant. Lettuce does the same thing. It bolts that time of year. That's why we get much better cilantro and lettuce production in our fall garden, because it keeps growing all during the short days of the winter. And then eventually the days get longer and it forces it into a reproductive state. And then there's some plants that are day neutral. It doesn't matter whether the day or the night is long. They're just going to bloom if the other conditions are correct. So there are a lot of day neutral plants. And again, a lot of this is based on where we fall. What's our latitude? Is it latitude? I thought it was longitude. So anyway, it's where we are based on the equator. So photoperiodism, you can have a short day plant like this is for poinsettias in particular. If you have a short day plant, but it has a long dark period, then it's going to flower, a long uninterrupted dark period. When the days are long in the summer, poinsettias aren't blooming because the nights are short. So it's in vegetative state. It's producing root stems and leaves. However, you can have a short day, and if you take that dark period and you interrupt it with light in the middle, that poinsettia will not bloom. That kalanchoe will not bloom. Those mums, those garden mums won't bloom, because it's the interruption of the night period that changes the chemistry inside the plant. There's a chemical that switches forms based on light, and it's called phytochrome. And there's a phytochrome A and a phytochrome B. And so basically it switches from one form to the other in the dark. And when light comes in, it switches it all back almost instantaneously to the original form. So if you have poinsettia, I had the example I think of is I had a lady when I was in high school. I was working at a nursery, and she was telling me about these poinsettias she had planted outside, because poinsettias grow outside here in the winter as long as it's mild. And she planted them on the side of her house, and they would never bloom. And she finally figured out one year that she lived on the end of a street, and there was another street that coincided with the side of her house with a stop sign. And so at night, she planted them on that side of the house, and cars would drive up at night with their headlights and shine them where those poinsettias are, and it would kept breaking the night period. And so her poinsettias on that side of the house never bloomed because the night was interrupted. Same thing with, you can say, well, I'm going to, people say, well, you can take your poinsettia, put it in a closet during the winter to make sure that, it blooms. And that's great. As long as you don't go in the closet and turn on the light to get something out of the closet. The same thing kind of happens with plants on your back porch. If you have kalanchoes on your back porch, and if you don't go out at night, it's great. But if you like to go outside at night and turn on the light, those kalanchoes aren't going to bloom on your back porch, because they need uninterrupted dark period in order to bloom. Otherwise, the dog starts barking at midnight. You go out to see if there's anything outside. You turn on the light. You just interrupted that. Once or twice is okay. If it's something that happens, that'll just delay the flowering a little bit. If it only happens once or twice over the floral induction period, which is anywhere from 2 to 6, 8 weeks, depending on the type of plant. If it only gets interrupted once or twice, it just delays the flowering. But if it happens a lot, then it's going to keep that plant from producing flowers. So here's some examples of long day plants, of a long day plant and a short day plant. And really, again, that's wrong, remember, because it should be a short night plant, which is the iris, or a long night plant, which is goldenrod. Think about it. When do we see the wildflower goldenrod? Because it does grow in our area, particularly a little further north. You go towards Victoria, you'll see a lot of goldenrod up in that space. But this was an example they gave. We see irises blooming in the summer. They don't bloom in the winter. Why? Because they need the short day, the short night, and the long days. So if you go in here and for the iris here in early summer, this is not from here. This is actually a little further north. But you have a short day and a long night. The iris is blooming, and in the winter time or the late fall, you have a long day and a short night, and it's not blooming. But if you would take that long night and you turn on lights for 10 minutes or flashes of light to break it up multiple times, it's going to perceive that as being 2 short night periods, and it's going to let that iris start to bloom. Goldenrod's the exact opposite, just like a poinsettia. When the day is long in the summer and the nights are short, there's no flowers. As the days get longer and we move past September into the fall and the early winter, you have long uninterrupted dark periods and you get flowering. If for some reason you interrupt that dark period, it won't develop flowers. So it's the breaking of the night period, the length of the night period, that's so important for these plants. Okay, that's what photoperiod is about. So any questions on I mean, again, this is an overview, just a quick, but realize some plants are affected by the length of the night versus day. Okay. Floral induction. The number one, besides the day length causing floral induction, the other one is, this is really thermal floral induction, and that's cool weather. Thermal induction or cooling is important for some plants to initiate flower buds. You think about that, what plants, when would a plant flower if it needs cold weather to initiate a flower bud?
Winter, early spring.
Winter and early spring. So what's an example of something that blooms in winter and early spring around here?
Bluebonnet, well, not bluebonnets are not here, but
Well, bluebonnets actually, the cooling in bluebonnets does actually help, because we talked about them being a biennial. That slows them down and makes it feel like it's two different seasons, and it will help force flowers faster. So cold weather can be a part of that. But think about shrubs. We talked about one the last time. Someone mentioned one the last time. What's the spring
oh,
flowering
the
shrub?
Mexican sage? No, not the Mexican sage.
Big tree.
The Indian hawthorn.
Indian hawthorn was one that was mentioned. Think about our fruit trees. Our fruit
Yeah,
trees
peaches,
need cold weather in
apples.
order to initiate and to allow those buds to continue to develop. Azaleas need cold weather in order to initiate flowers and let those flowers slowly develop. Many of our bulbs, those spring flowering bulbs, they need cold weather to initiate flowers. If you ever had Easter lilies, and Easter lilies will rebloom if you plant them in the ground down here. But when you bought them initially, remember, they probably had 5, 6 flowers on them, and they're really big and pretty. You put them out in your yard, and you get a little spindly plant, and you get a little tiny flower on it. On a cold winter, if they were further north, they would have more cold weather and you'd have more flowers. When we buy bulbs here, and most of those spring flowering bulbs that we think of, the tulips and the hyacinths and stuff like that, they're good for about a year here because we don't have enough cold weather to reinitiate the flowering. When you purchase those, they have been pre-cooled. They were dug, they were put in giant containers and moved into giant storage rooms, giant cooling rooms, to make sure that they were at the right temperature to initiate flowers, so that when they take them out and they ship them off all over the world, they're going to flower. But if they're in a warm climate, they're not going to flower again unless you want to dig them up and put them in your refrigerator. And I'll tell you, that's an awful lot of work. So that's why many bulbs don't reflowers, because they need cold weather, thermal and floral induction. And so really that's the bottom line. That's all I wanted to introduce you to, that is that some plants need that cold weather to initiate flower buds. Then we'll talk a little bit about dormancy and some of those flower buds. This is primarily dormancy, talking about cold weather dormancy for fruit trees, because that's what y'all will probably get the most questions about. It can be, dormancies in general can be caused by environmental conditions or physiological conditions, chemicals within the plant. Environmental, like in the summer, roses don't bloom as much in the summer because environmentally it's too hot. So that's an environmental condition that can cause roses to go dormant and not bloom properly. Others could be physiological, meaning that the chemical balance is not right within the plant. There's some inhibitor in the plant that needs to be released. And that's what we look at with flower buds that are formed in the fall and then released in the spring. So flower buds may need some, particularly flower buds that are produced in the fall and the winter, they may need a certain amount of cold weather or cool weather to break that dormancy. And we talked about this the last time with temperate fruit trees. And that's where they need those chill units. That's cumulative hours between about 32 or 32 degrees and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That cool temperature, not freezing cold, but just above freezing. And that's what you're finding in early spring, late winter. Because if it's in the heart of winter, it's not going to accumulate those chill units when it's below 32, because that tree doesn't want to shoot the moon the one time it gets to flower by flowering once it gets, if it's accumulating chill units under 32, it does not do that because the way the chemicals are designed, it doesn't want to flower too early. And so those chill units, like I said the last time, you get partial chill units. The higher that temperature is, between like 40 and 50, you get partial chill units. When you're closer to 32, 35, you're getting pretty much an hour to an hour. So the lower the temperature, closer to 32, the higher the chill unit accumulation per hour. And then once you get above 55 degrees, you start losing chill units. When you have those warm days, you start losing the chill units that had been acquired. If you didn't get enough before that starts happening, then you have to have more cold weather to help release those flower buds. So again, those warm winters, when you get hot and cold, you can accumulate chill hours and then lose them. So there's a lot of models that are created that look at the temperature and the duration of that temperature, and there's huge mathematical formulas. They try to predict what's going to happen with it. I spent 2.5 years working on that, and it wasn't a lot of fun, but it's interesting. So again, remember, no chill units accumulate below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is back to that, remember early on we talked about the map that showed the chill unit accumulation of, we're at about 300 to 400 here near Corpus Christi. And you look at Southern Florida, they're at 200. Central Florida is the same range as us, about 400. And then you move up, it goes to about 600 to 800 as you move towards Fredericksburg, and then it moves up more as you go towards Dallas. So again, those lines, and that's the accumulated chill units, because those are much colder areas. They're colder for a longer period of time, and they don't have as many of those hot winter days to lose the chill units. And that's because those temperate trees are trying to not flower too early so that they don't lose the flowers and the fruit to cold weather, that they're not going to freeze. This year we had that, we had some trees had already started flowering when that big cold front came through, and it killed flower buds, or flower buds were just starting to expand. They had already started to break dormancy. I had seen some trees starting to get leaves on them. Those buds were starting to expand, and they were stunted, and they had to come back later with just regular leaves, much less flowers. So that's all about temperate flowers, temperate flowering trees. That's going to be apples and pears and peaches and nectarines and things like that. Okay, so understand chilling units and looking for that on those fruit trees is really, really important. And does that help a little bit to remind you of what we talked about? Okay. And the last thing I'm going to talk about are tropisms. Tropisms are a plant growth reaction to an environmental stimulus, primarily light and gravity. So it's caused by a hormonal change within the stem of the plant. So it appears to be a movement or a growth in a certain direction, usually to light or gravity. If it's due to light, it's called phototropism. If it's due to gravity, it's gravitropism. And that's when you have a plant in your window. We talk about putting a plant in your window. You want to turn that plant around so it doesn't grow towards the window. What's happening, the dark side is producing auxins. Auxin is a hormone in the plant that helps with rooting, but it also stretches cells, plant cells. So the cells on the dark side of the plant are stretching, they're expanding a little bit more than the ones on the other side. So it appears the plant is growing towards the light. Well, that's important because you want the top of those leaves to get as much light as possible for photosynthesis. So that is an adaptation of that plant to try to get as much light as possible in a low light situation. That's why plants stretch or plants seem to grow towards light. You turn that plant around, the other side of the stem's going to stretch then, and then it would help even out the growth pattern. With gravity, if you have a plant in a pot and it falls over, a tomatoes are, that happens all the time. You buy a tomato plant and it happens in a hurry with a tomato plant. You buy a tomato plant, it falls over for 2 days, and you start looking and the plant has already started growing upward. That is that plant trying to grow towards the light, and it's a gravitropism. That's actually a gravitropism response. Palm trees, there were some palm trees I've seen in the past where people would plant them at an angle and then they would start growing upward. So you have part of the trunk at an angle where they were first planted, and then all the new growth starts growing straight up. That's a gravitropism response. It just takes a lot longer to see that. So basically it's just the hormones causes the plant cells to stretch, either on the dark side, if it's a phototropism side, to stretch that plant growth towards the light, or on gravitropism, it's on the ground side to help that plant grow towards the sun. So again, that's the growing up direction. So it's all caused by auxins. Again, that's a hormone within the plant. It's one of the 5 major plant hormone groups, and that causes that stretching on the side of the stem. That's the same thing that also in low light, just when the light's low, we talked about, remember, plant stretching, that internodal elongation from the coleus that's in the shade, the stretching of the stem, that's from extra auxin in darkness. So the same principle. And that's all I got. So you just had a semester's worth of an overview of a semester's worth of botany in less than 3.5 hours. And you're not tested on you're not gonna be tested on all those specific terms and what's the perianth and the calyx, but I want you to see the big picture of how it works together, because you will hear some of those terms and you go, "Ooh, I don't remember what that is." Go back in your book when you get your book and say, "Oh yeah, that's what this plant part is. That's what that's what a world arrangement is versus an alternate arrangement versus an opposite arrangement." You use them a few times, you'll go, "Oh yeah, that makes sense now." Or what's the difference between photosynthesis and respiration? Looking at those things, or that floral induction, that you have to have that cold weather for the bulbs. Now you kind of see a little bit of the reason why. It's a mechanism that those plants use for survival to make sure that they are blooming at the right time and protecting themselves against poor environmental conditions. So that's what I got. And
Any questions for Michael?
It's 8:34. So we started almost 30 minutes late and 25 minutes late, and we made up part of that time.
Any questions for Michael?
I have one question.
Yep.
So in the presence of of poisons or chemicals that are being shot out by the factories and so forth, how do the plants are going to absorb it, correct?
Some of it can be absorbed by plants, not all of it. It just depends on how it is deposited. Some chemicals are in the ground. Some of them are absorbed, some of them are not. Some in the air can be absorbed into plants. Some of them not as much as others.
Can they get rid of them as fast because they are plants?
What do you mean?
Like certain chemicals.
Are they purifying the air, is what you're saying, of the chemicals?
No, not purifying their, let's say it's in the soil. Okay, so these chemicals get into the plants. Are the plants able to release or as fast, much more faster than anything else? Or do they stay in the plant and does?
They usually are within the plant. If they absorb it, most of those are not going to be released. They're going to be absorbed by the plant. That's what I would think. You know,
Okay.
that's why you can take plant samples too, if you're worried about toxicity of things. And they
Right.
can check for toxins within the plant to see if they're actually absorbing it. You can have it in the soil, but it doesn't mean that certain plants are going to take it up.
Okay,
depending on
that's another question. That's a good question. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, a couple of announcements.